Hi everyone, I really hope that you will not have to see this video, because if you do, it means that unfortunately we had technical difficulties and I wasn't able to give the talk live to you through Skype as originally intended. So I'm sorry, I would have loved to be there. So let's get started. Today I'd like to talk to you about Beyond Ice, a game that I released last year, and how I went about it in terms of writing, things that I learned about creating stories for different media, and what I like to give you as some advice to how to create more interesting stories as a storyteller.
I'm a storyteller, and I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer. And when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow. They ate apples. And they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now, this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria. I had never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow. We ate mangoes, and we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. My characters also drank a lot of ginger beer because the characters in the British books I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. And for many years afterwards, I would have a desperate desire to taste ginger beer. But that is another story. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify.
So in video games, we tend to see the same video game stories over and over and over again. You know, stories about a guy who his family or loved ones are murdered in front of him, and he goes in some sort of revenge killing spree after. We see stories where you are the one true only hero that can save the galaxy. We see stories about hostage situations, and a lot of times they come across as very uninspiring. I mean, that's like the best possible scenario, is that, you know, it's just boring and uninspiring and a cliche. But the thing is, at its worst, it really stagnates the medium, and it alienates and also damages a huge audience, which it can be both potential or existing. So right before I started working on Beyond Ice, I wrote a little manifest for myself and my future work, and I kind of vowed to never create anything that had already been done before, because, you know, I like the idea of creating a new experience, to give audiences something that they haven't seen before, and tell a different story, a different voice, or a different point of view on a story that is all this time. So yeah, that's when Beyond Ice came, and so here's a little trailer for those of you who don't know Beyond Ice. people ask me, like, how did you come up with the idea? Why did you, as a non-blind person, decide to make a game about being blind? I always have to tell them, and I'm kind of surprised that I didn't intend to make a game about a blind girl. I'm trying to make a game that came from the mechanics and the visual style, and I wanted to have a story and a protagonist that kind of fit that theme. So for me, yeah, Beyond Eyes is not about her being blind. It's a story about finding courage. It's a story about loss, about grief, about coping with grief, about being confronted with this part where a situation seemed completely hopeless, but even then, like in the bleakest of times, there's always an opportunity for friendship. There's an opportunity to finding new beautiful things and engaging, but you have to look for them or smell for them or just actively try to get the best out of a situation. And that's what Beyond Eyes is really about. It's also another thing, which will come later in my talk. So when I started working on the game, of course I had to do research because it started out as a school project. So I talked to blind people and people that have worked with blind people. And as far as I can recall, like all the response that I got was really positive, especially from people that were blind or worked with blind people or had, family members or loved ones that were blind, were really interested. And I liked the idea of having a hero that wasn't able, that had some form of imperfection that was different than this average person that can do anything that they want. And the thing is, I did get some notes about people being worried, like, okay, how will you be able to do, are you not romanticizing this disability? And who are you to make these sort of stories? And this is something that you will see in the talk from Roy as well, is people have this tendency to say, stick to what you know. So if you are, don't try to write something you're not. Don't try to write about the struggle of generation, about a gender, about a social class, about a race, about ethnicity, unless you're part of it. And I get that idea of thinking that you can only truly capture a feeling as long as you have gone through that struggle. At the same time, as a writer, I think you definitely should be able to go and try, for several reasons. I mean, first of all, in the end, stories are about people, not so much about events. And this is something that kind of is something that you see more understanding of in media like books or video, but not so much games, because a lot of times when we think about the game story, it's about an event, like a terrorist group attacks this sort of piece, or there's an alien invasion coming. There's some sort of external conflict that our heroes often have no other choice than just dive in there and go with that flow. So yeah, it makes for a plot, but it doesn't make for an interesting deep emotion. Even in the end, stories are about people, and people have emotions, and emotions are universal. So, for example, I do not know what it's like to be a blind girl, but I do know what it's like to be a girl who loses something that they held very dear. Beyond Eyes, along the way, became a story of me trying to find peace, or trying to share a story of how I lost my father, who was named Ray as the protagonist of the game. And how that kind of turned my world upside down, and how I took the lessons that I learned from it, finding happiness and going outside and making new friends and coping with that pain, and turning it into a metaphor. So in that sense, Beyond Eyes is a fairy tale. The problem with, now we're on the topic of people should know write what they know about. This is a this is basically what is wrong with a lot of popular media when it comes to interesting and unique stories. If you go to the and check out the writing room of a show that you like on television, chances are that there are people that are very specific, like they have a very narrow demographic. A lot of them are males. Most of them are middle class and white. And this means that if they only write from their experience, you get a very narrow, not only you get a very bland type of story, because without the experiences of a more diverse crowd, these people write stories about the stuff that they know and the things they don't know about. Like, for example, different ethnicities, different genders, different everything. They tend to get their inspiration from those single stories that we hear about. So you get series and films that are filled with cliches. There's only one type that an Indian guy gets portrayed, or there's only a specific way in which a Jewish woman will be portrayed, because that's the single story that is being put out there all the time. So one option, of course, is to diversify the people that go create things. But the other thing is that the writers themselves take more effort in getting acquainted with different cultures, different people, like surrounding themselves with different people, and become better at, grasping the complexity, how complex real life is, the complexity, whatever. I'm sorry. How complex real life actually is, and that there are so many different ways to see this single subject. So, of course, it means that as a writer, you do have a responsibility to thoroughly do your research and to talk to people, and to, try to find those multiple stories before you choose one to write. And you have to think about every aspect along the way. Like, is this way that I'm portraying this character or this situation, why do I do this? Is this based on something that I think makes sense? That this is the normal way to go? If so, where does that normal, who made that default? Is it something that I know from other media, or is it something that, you have to do your research, and you have to be able to question yourself on everything. So last year, in August, Beyond Ice launched on PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and PC, and Mac, and Linux, and you can buy it on Steam, right? Anyway, I'm not gonna do that. So yeah, the game launched, and I got tons of reactions, like a lot of emails, messages, from all different kinds of stories. And there was one that really stood out of me, like a couple of them, of course. Some people talked about, I had messages from people that, had previously been legally blind, and regained sight later in life, and they kind of felt they told me how they related to the story, which was positive. There were people that felt close to people that they did know, like a family member that was visually impaired. There were people that, even though they didn't directly have this experience, it resonated with them with an earlier trauma, which was absolutely brilliant. But then I got another message. And it was it was this one right here, which basically said, your game is inspiration porn. It damages the community of people with disabilities, and you make it that some people feel like they should be ashamed or feel incomplete as long as they have this disability. So. The first thought that I had, because this came with, this quote is part of a larger mail, and it was kind of interesting. It came with a long list of literature. It basically said, if you're gonna make games about disability, do your research, which I did. So the first thing I did first feeling that I felt was like this really, I felt a little bit offended. So my initial response was to go, full defense, because my intentions were pure. I mean, I had done my research, who is this person that they're attacking me, had they even played the game? Problem was, for me, unfortunately, it turned out that they hadn't played the game. They did it based on a few images and a trailer that they saw online, and kind of made up their mind before even playing the game. which was unfortunately the case with a lot of criticism that I got, which I say unfortunate because it would have been good for me to get criticism from people that, you know, play the game and said like, this is wrong with it, you can be better, you can improve on this and this matter. As it was the situation, I couldn't. So I sent them an email. I took a deep breath, I cleared my thoughts, and I kind of explained like, I'm under the impression that you haven't played the game, and I feel like you've, you know, came to your conclusions based on incomplete information. So I offered them a chance to play the game and, you know, talk it over once they were finished and have a good conversation about it. But unfortunately I never heard back, which is a shame though, because I think it would have been interesting. And I think that's an important lesson to learn as well. I mean, if you do your research, if you write well, if you take that leap and write about new things that you've never heard of, and you have to make sure that whatever you write, you're behind it. And when you are behind it, it also means that you should be held accountable for it. So if people come to you and they say, this and this offends me, even if you disagree, you have to be able to defend yourself, but also allow yourself to think, is this something that is actually a valid concern, and how can I improve my writing for future projects? So speaking of accountability, being accountable for your work, this also means that originally for the last few months I worked on a game, and this game had the sole purpose for me raising money for girls in Vietnam, because it's part of I'm going there tomorrow, which is basically why I'm not there. I'm flying to Vietnam in a couple of hours, and the idea was raising money through a game to help girls get access to better healthcare, to education, and a better shot at life. And I made a game about a Vietnamese girl, a day in her life, to kind of show people what it was like, and to and sell the game for money and have the proceeds go to this fund, this charity that I'm working with. So what happened was, even though with all my good intentions and the research that I did, and I talked back and forth with people, I had the charity, all their information pooled to create a game that made sense. Even with all my good intentions, my research and the knowledge, I still fell into that trap of creating a single story. And you know, it's a story about, you know, a poor little girl whose odds in life were so crappy compared to us. And, you know, for just a few euros or dollars, you would be able to give her a better shot at life. The thing is, you've probably seen these stories shared on media a lot. I mean, you've seen commercials, you've probably seen sad pictures of little girls or little boys or puppies, you know, somewhere in on your Facebook page. And they're effective. I mean, they kind of touch people and they help raise that money. But the problem with that is that it's not an empowering story. It's that same single story, like we are fortunate in the West, and people that live in third or even second world countries should be pitied, and you know, they would need our generosity to have a chance at life. It's damaging. It's not an empowering story, and in the end, I couldn't. I'm sorry. I'm a bit embarrassed that I wrote it. Actually, it was such a stupid thing to do. So I played this game and I checked. And it's like, this is something that I'm guilty of creating, that single stupid story. So in the end, I decided not to make it, and I'm going to Vietnam tomorrow, and I'm going to travel around and I'm going to meet new people. Some of those little girls I'm going to meet. I'm going to talk to them, you know, and I'm going to, you know, talk to them, and I'm going to learn about their hopes and dreams, and I'm probably going to find out that they are very similar to the little boys and the little girls that we have here or there in Austin with you. And that's the thing. Their stories will probably inspire me, and I will come back and I will write a new story, and it will be a good story. It will be a different story. A story that still hopefully inspires people to support the projects that give them new chances, but also focus more on the things that they can do, empowers them, like make them little heroes, instead of these sad people, needy people that we like to, the stories we like to tell in the media. So that was my lesson for that. So there's a couple of things that I learned from making Beyond Ice that I'm now using in my new projects. During Beyond Ice, I worked on a game, a small game, and it was called Almost Home, and it told the story of a young refugee trying to escape from a war-torn city, and it was kind of a response based on a lot of stories, like a lot of games where you play as a soldier and you shoot, you have all these beautiful scenery that you completely can shoot to pieces, and I kind of wanted to make a game that on the first glance would look like such a game, like taking place in a war-torn city, but it would actually be about this person trying to deal with repercussions, the consequences of war that you would normally not see in a game. And so to my surprise, I made this game, and it was a very intimate and sad game. And I showed it to a couple of people, and to my surprise, people didn't really focus on the things that I wanted them to focus on. So instead of focusing on this young refugee and her the horror she had to go through and the human aspect of this story, people were trying to draw comparisons to real life. It's like, oh, she looks a certain way, she must be this ethnicity, so you are probably making a game about this and this real life conflict. But yeah, if you're gonna do this, you probably need to show this part of that conflict as well. It's a very biased way. And it's like, this is not a political game. It's really a game about survival, about holding on to humanity. When you're struggling. So this is basically one of the things that kind of showed me that I needed a new approach to be able to make games that are interesting, to tell diverse stories. Because one of the things is that people will always make comparisons to real life, like I told with the war example. What they also think is that people unconsciously seem to be really digging or holding on to that single story. There's only one way to tell a story. So for example, when something happens in a game, for example, Gone Home came out, and it tells about a relationship between one girl and another girl, and then surprise, surprise, more games came out, and there were actually some girls there that also had lesbian relationships, and people started complaining. It's like, oh, again with the lesbians? It's like, we already had this game. Do we really need another game with lesbians? Which of course is complete bollocks, because people seem to think we know this one story, so we don't need another one. And this is kind of, we had this text, which is it's ridiculous. So that's one thing. That's the other thing. We have the problem with people trying to find links with real life, people trying to hold on to that single story of what they already know in popular media. So my answer to that problem is fantasy. And I don't mean fantasy in the sense of, orcs and elves and knights and damsels in distress, because even though the idea of fantasy is that it can be anything, because fantasy, a lot of fantasy seems to inherit from the same principles. You have your Game of Thrones or The Witcher, and they kind of say, yeah, we are sort of inspired, by these medieval times, and yeah, well, it was a very patriarchy, so, women in the kitchen, women make children, women have no power, and men are the knights. And even though we sometimes make these characters that are different, they're always the exceptions within their world. You have a Brianna, who is awesome, but she's also a very rare person in this universe. And I like to think that you should be the change you want to see in the world. So if you don't like I do, the way that certain minorities or certain genders or certain people or situations are handled in popular media, you can change that. And you don't have to create characters that, against all odds, succeed. You can write societies that don't have these problems that we are currently fighting with. You can explore ideas, models based on, what would it be like if everyone was equal? What would it be like if we had no, insert this common thing, and experiment with what the possible outcomes would be. So instead of having the same conflicts over and over again, you don't have your fantasy world to inherit from the real world. You don't have to do that. And for me, creating these fantasy worlds it's liberating. I can talk about things that I find interesting, about love, about forced marriage, about politics, about war, without having to worry of people trying to find connection with real life. I can make people with all sorts of skin types, all sorts of religions. I can make up religions. They don't have to be based on real life situations, and in turn help people to get a more neutral stance. Because if you ask someone, if I would make a game, for example, if I make Almost Home, and it would be about a conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, you would have an opinion on this real war. You've seen the news stories, you have an opinion, which means it will be more difficult for you to see a side that I'm trying to tell you. Than it would be if you would have a completely imaginary conflict. It will be easier to see it from different sides. Tell your stories and be free in the way that you tell them. Don't use fantasy as an excuse for sexism, for racism, for lack of diversity in skin tones or religion or anything. You don't have to inherit from the status quo. You can make room for the conflicts. So, that being said, my new series of games that I'm currently working on does exactly this. It's a collection of short games. They are all part of a larger narrative, but they tell different stories, and each game is a small, new kind of way of a new type of character that tells a story from their point of view. And they're everywhere. They're everything. They're like small children, old people, young people, a pottery maker, to a soldier, to a seamstress. They all can be heroes. And I would really, if you take one thing away from this talk, is please go out there. Go make those stories, because we can all sit here and complain about lack of diversity in media, but in the end, the best way to battle it is to create the content that we would like to experience for ourselves. So go out there, be the change you want to see in the world. Go write stories, do your research, and when the time comes, stand by it, defend it, and be awesome.